October 24th, 1942. El Alamein, Egypt, 05:35 hours. Dawn lifts like a lid off a kettle. The barrage that ruled the night gutters to a steadier rumble. And in that breath between hammer blows, General Major Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma leans over the sand table and drags a finger across the ridges, as if he could cut a new wadi with will alone. Mitiria, he says, tapping the long bone of ground where mine belts and wire have been worried all night by British sappers. We hit here with what we have, not what we want. The operations officer of 15. Panzer ticks off the arithmetic without drama. Serviceable runners PZK-FW A3 OSF L and M with long 5 cm guns. A few PZK-FW I4 OSF EF2 with the 7.5 cm KWK-40 a brace of Marder 3s. Precious 8.8 cm Flak 36s dragged up on Hanomag tractors. 2 batteries of 10.5 cm LEF H-18 howitzers. Ammo tight, fuel tighter. The order goes in thin Morse along crackling lines and by clipped voice over Fug 5 sets Spare Feuer, Stoßtrupp 4, 15, Panzer Rechts, Einheitsten Panzer Links, Arietta holds center, out past the CP. Drivers thumb to wakefulness kick Maybachs into coughs that become liquid. Crews heave track pins, slam turret doors, check traverse by feel little, practiced rituals that keep fear from getting first bite. On the forward slope, Folgore paratroopers nod to the passing panzers with the brief, professional respect of men who've already paid tonight's bill and will pay again. At 06:00, the first German smoke shells bloom gray-green across Mitiria, like wet wool thrown on a bonfire. Von Thoma climbs onto the deck of a Ps-4, boots ringing against the armor. He prefers to see from height. He has no illusions about what height invites. Vorwärts. The company lurches in file, then fans, keeping daylight between hulls the way men keep daylight between bad memories. They meet the British corridors not as roads, but as scars, flanks of earth churned white, where Bangalore torpedoes ripped wire. Blackened mouths where sappers found S-mines with their boots. A Panzer III noses to the tape, and the driver breathes double time. The lane fits a tank with 2 palms of mercy to spare. On the other side, British armor waits masked. The 1st Armored Division has Shermans with 75 mm guns, and Grants with their odd shoulder-mounted sponson ungainly to look at. Ruinous to ignore, posted like doorstops behind the cleared gaps. The first exchange is almost gentle at 1,000 yards. British HE slaps the sand in starbursts. German APCBC answers with clean, narrow fountains of dust. Then the range shrinks. A Panzer III takes a Sherman on the cheek. Sparks and paint. No kill. An 88 barks once from a low pit and a Grant heaves. Turret still. As if surprised that a hole could be punched into a shape that had seemed whole. Right flank. Smoke, more smoke, calls Oberleutnant Kruger over the net. Voice clipped behind a cloth throat mic. British artillery obliges him with the opposite, a stonk that lays a table of iron in front of 21. Panzers point. 80 guns, then more. Their fire scheduled on map references with the metronome logic Montgomery has drilled into his core. You can hear the plan crash. Lift, creep, crash again, as if a tide had learned to count. In the gaps between impacts. The RAF comes through in tidy sticks, Bostons and Mitchells stepping bombs along the German gun line, while Kitty Hawks rake flare-lit wheel tracks with 50s. By 07:10, the counterstroke is a 3-sided fistfight. 15. Panzer's lead companies find a seam and press into it, long 5s biting at the curves of Sherman turrets. 21. Panzer on the left takes a lane already plotted by British FOU binoculars, and pays in track and coolant. Arietta's M1340's game as ever. Try to worry the hinge in the center and discover again what an undergunned heart feels like under a mailed fist. Von Thoma sees all of this in glimpses from the commander's cupola smoked glass. Then sand. Then a flash of a red-white tank recognition panel on a British engine deck, and he understands in his ribs what his staff ratio said. At midnight, the 8th Army can afford to attack where Panzer Army can only afford to answer. A voice breaks his net. Tight with effort, munition stand Knapp Hauptmann. We are red on Peace Gear 39. Another fuel at 30 liters per. After this, we crawl, a third. Flat with that particular tone of professionalism that sounds like calm until you listen closely, Ariete requests fires. They're taking on Shermans at 600 and dying like soldiers. Von Thoma throttles back to the shadow of a hummock, drops to the deck, and studies the smoke in layers. He knows where his reserves should be and knows, too, why they are not Operation Bertram's dummy dumps and fake tanks have pinned his movable mass too far north for this hour. This place. When he keys the transmitter again. He makes his voice as level as a carpenter's rule. Feuerstellung 88. Forward by bounds. Target the entrances to the lanes, not the tanks. Make them think the road is cursed. The 88 crews oblige with textbook brutality. Low over open sights. Traverse by shoulder. Elevate by wrist. Fire when the world holds still for a half breath. The first 4 rounds take 2 grants and jam Alamein mouth with smoking persuasion. The 5th round finds a Sherman that had the bad manners to pause to adjust a wireless aerial. It folds at the turret ring as if a hinge had failed. For 10 minutes, the battlefield looks as if it could lean Germany's way. Then the British guns return to the schedule, and schedule turns out to be a weapon sharper than any blade. Counter battery locates the 88s by their lightning and answers with method crash, lift, crash. Some guns die, some displace, and some live to find the next target, but fewer with each answer. The 8th Army's FOUs adjust with hand signals and short reports. Drop 100, add 2. Left 1, and the weight moves with the words. Brigadier Curry's 9th Armored Brigade pushes elements forward to prod the seam. The prong breaks, but the pressure remains. And pressure, in Montgomery's book, is the point. By late morning, the counterattack has lost its adjectives. It is no longer sharp or violent or promising. It is simply ongoing, which in the desert means fuel gauges trending down while barrels trend up. A Ps-4 crawls out of a lane with 1 track thrown. The crew bails to refit the links under mortar patter and the indifferent approval of a Stuka that will not arrive, far to the rear. A signals truck from 90. Leichter throws a long wire antenna and tries to raise Luftflotte 2. The reply is a polite absence. The RAF has the day parceled, and what the RAF does not take, the dust steals. At 13:20, a dispatch rider roars into Von Thoma's makeshift command point, goggles white with dried salt. He hands a buff envelope stamped EILT. Rommel's signature is not on it. He is still in Germany recovering from infection, but the cadence of the words is his conserved tanks. Counterblow only when the target is fixed. Avoid attrition battles that logistics cannot feed. Von Thoma looks out over the ground that has 15. Panzer's tracks written on it like a diary and makes the kind of choice that stains a stomach. Break contact by packets. Fall back 1 wadi's worth. Refit what runs. We hit again at last light. He climbs back onto the PZ-4. Taps Coke today's driver. As superstitious about names as any frontline man on the shoulder. And rides as the company edges out of the British artillery's measurable hand. To the south. A dust column marks where 7th Armored has probed and paused. To the north, white tape gleams where sappers have widened the Lightfoot lanes for heavy things that move on stubborn ideas. The Africa Corps withdraws a few thousand meters and is somehow smaller for the distance. That evening, a new name arrives with the wind Monty's jaws. Staff humor. But it bites. The image holds infantry teeth in the minefields at night. Artillery the hinge, armor the muscle, and logistics the throat that swallows. The British can chew and keep chewing. Panzer Armee can only clench and unclench until the hand tires. Von Thoma dictates his report with sand still on his lips. He does not flatter and does not plead. Artillery mass decisive, he says. Enemy deception fixed our reserves. Ammunition shortage limits counter battery. Fuel low. Italian formations hold bravely but cannot maneuver. We can hurt him. We cannot outlast him here. A pause. Then the sentence that feels like a man writing against his own blood, unless the situation in the rear improves. A break-in becomes a breakthrough in days, not weeks. Night comes, unasked and insufficient. The British gunners eat hot stew and then go back to their sights. German gunners lay their next fire missions by the taste of cordite and habit. somewhere near Kidney Ridge. An Australian platoon sleeps in turns with their boots on, somewhere at Fuca. Supply officers count tins and drum a pencil against figures that do not move. The desert does not care either way. It will be here when men are not. October 24th, 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. 16:10 hours. Heat flattens the afternoon when the rumor hardens into a sentence Generaloberst Georg Stumme is missing. His command car was found nose first in a shallow wadi. The wireless dead. The driver shell-shocked. Men say Stumme stepped out to read the ground and never came back. By dusk, the truth catches up. Heart failed under shell fire, and Panzerarmee Africa, already fighting by reflex, is headless for the length of a bad breath. In the gap, General Major Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma does what professionals do. He shortens lines, stiffens liaison with the Italians Ariete near Tel El Akakir, Trieste and Bologna guarding the northern ribs, and orders his 88s to trade distance for survivability. Feuer und Hupfen, he tells the batteries, fire and hop. Night, 1930. The British don't sleep, they measure. Lines of 25-pounders and 5.5-inch mediums are picked up, nudged, relayed by the cold arithmetic of survey teams who work by star and prismatic compass. Sappers widen Lightfoot's lanes, white tape gleaming like fish belly under blackout lamps so that heavier things can move where only feet and nerve went last night. Infantry dig in on the Gaines 51st Highland Division squats into the gravel near Mitiria. The New Zealanders tighten their bite along the ridge. Farther north, the 9th Australian Division leans against the coastal railway embankment at Tel El Isa and Tel El Mak Kad. In the dark, you can hear the 8th Army's throat-clearing splash of petrol into jerrycans, clink of tool rolls on Sherman engine decks, the soft, peppering cough as Desert Air Force Kitty Hawks taxi and are pointed into a wind that smells of cordite and brine. October 25th, 02:40 hours. Rommel's Ju-52 drops him at Fuca. He is thinner than the photographs, eyes sunk deep by infection and too little sleep. But the appetite for control is unhurt. The first reports he gathers are not about heroics. They are about tonnage, artillery ammunition expenditure, British heavy, sustained, industrial. Fuel British delivered to the gun line by pipeline and road in a flow that looks like policy. Not luck. Air RAF present in a schedule you could set a watch to, and where the RAF is not, the sandstorm is. Der Engländer hat gelernt, he says flatly. The Englishman has learned. He takes back command and drives forward into a battle already decided by weights and measures rather than dash. Dawn, 06:05. The day begins with a voice Australian, ragged with effort, cracking across a brigade net fixed bayonets. At the coast, the 9th Australian Division pushes again. Not in a grand sweep, but with the stubborn cadence that has been wearing the northern hinge thin for 48 hours. Their 2-pounder portees nose into shallow scoops, old weapons insisting on a present tense behind them. British 6-pounders are manhandled into strips of shadow along the embankment. Panzer Grenadiers counter, Feldgrau cutting like wire through dew. It is infantry work grenades in shallow trenches, the slam of Enfields. MG-34s sawing, and then, as if a switch is thrown, the desert fills with the bright, combing whine of RAF fighter bombers stepping ordnance along a grid. Rommel hears it from the car roof where he has climbed to see over the bitter little world of a forward command post Kein Jabo Schutz. No fighter cover. He doesn't bother to ask why. Luftflotte 2 cannot make a promise it doesn't have the fuel to keep. Mid-morning to noon, the tug in the center never stops. At Kidney Ridge, British FOUs whisper corrections, add 50. Left 1, and the fire moves like a flock of iron birds. German gun commanders, veterans who have learned the British lies and truths, play the old game of displacement, 3 rounds from the 10.5-centimeter Lee FH-18s. Then limber, then new pits scratched where the earth is already tired. Marders rake at grants whose high shoulders betray them. Pizzy KPFFU-4 F2s bite when they can. That long 7.5 centimeter giving back the range Germans are used to owning. But the duels are fewer. Most of the day is lived under the lid of an artillery problem the British have solved with method mass. Communications discipline and ammunition that arrives on time. At 11:40. Rommel reads a captured orders fragment pepperpot and smiles without humor. He has just seen it in practice mortars, Bofors, Vickers, even captured Italian guns, all roped into timed concentrations that rattle nerves as thoroughly as they shake bolts. Ein Mörserkrieg, he mutters, a mortar war, when he asks for a counterblow. Fantoma gives him the only answer there is: where we mass, we are seen. Where we are seen, we are fixed. Fuel figures follow like a funeral columns mauled last night on the Rommel track. Petrol cans that never arrived. A battalion that can counterattack at dawn only to halt at noon because gauges tell the truth even when men won't. Afternoon, 14:30, on the northern shoulder. Ariete earns another page of respect. Italian tankers crowd their M13-40s and Semoventes into the seam between Australian teeth and British jaw, trading shots with Shermans at 800 yards. Some die hard. Some back out with drivers steering on muscle memory through smoke that makes the sun look like a coin at the bottom of a well. Rommel watches their brigade commander report with the crispness of a parade square. Munizioni scarce. My ragazzi resistono. Ammunition scarce. But the boys hold. Rommel nods like a man signing for a debt, then looks south where the New Zealand Corps has shouldered deeper along Miteria, and British armor is queuing in cleared lanes for something larger. Evening orders, 1810. Montgomery does not thunder, he schedules. His new set piece is already being chalked a switching of weight for an operation he calls, with typical lack of drama, Supercharge. It will strike in November where the mine belts thin at Tel El Akakir, throwing the 9th Armored Brigade in a sacrificial pry to open the door for 1st Armored Division. Tonight, though, it is still Lightfoot's work, bite and hold. Widen the lanes, crush the gun line. British RASC lorries pump fuel from portable Bowsers into Sherman bellies, while chaplains hand tea up into turrets and mechanics change final drive oils by touch. The 8th Army looks like a factory that has been rolled forward to the front. Rommel's report. 21 Tujrul. He dictates in short, unadorned sentences. The way a man writes instructions for a machine he doesn't own anymore. Britische Artillerie in Massen, gut geführt. British artillery in mass, well controlled. Feind täuscht Reserven. Unsere Gegenstöße laufen ins Leere. Enemy deception fixes our reserves. Our counterstrokes find only air, Verluste erträglich, aber Ersatz fehlt. Losses tolerable, replacements absent. He does not ask for miracles. He asks for fuel and air, and the kind of ammunition tables that begin with a 2 and not a 0. The answer that rides back down the wire is silence. Then the thin promise of a few trains and barges at Tobruk and Benghazi. If the RAF will kindly look elsewhere, the RAF is not in a mood to be kind. October 26th, 05:20 hours. A chill sits on the sand. The 9th Australian Division lurches forward again along the coast, and with their shove 15. Panzer and 164, Leichter, are compelled to give ground they cannot replace with geometry alone. Behind them, Italian infantry dig with a zeal that has nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with living till sunset. Fantoma radios an economy order, Feuerdisziplin streng, and gun captains count the shells left, not by crate, but by hand, 7, 4, 3. When an 88 announces itself and lives, the line stiffens. When it is found and gutted, the line flows backward like water around a stone. Midday brings the sort of coincidence staff colleges hate, and veterans recognize a lull exactly when the sun is worst. The British use it to move guns. The Germans use it to steal sleep and weld cracks in mantlets that will crack again in 4 hours. Over it all moves the RAF, no longer hunting, simply tending the battle's direction like shepherds tend a flock. Das ist nicht mehr ein Duell, Rommel says to nobody in particular as he watches dust columns bloom where ammunition parks are being rearranged. Es ist ein Betrieb. It is no longer a duel. It is an enterprise. Night, 26th into 27th. The desert shivers with engine ticks. Signals units for both sides stringline like spider silk across the scrub. Orderlies pad between trenches with mugs that steam, somewhere in the black. A German patrol brings in a prisoner from the 51st Highlanders who asks for a cigarette and then, politely, asks what day it is. Dienstag. Tuesday. He nods. And the corner of his mouth tilts as if the answer had confirmed a private schedule inside his head. In Cairo and Alexandria, ships unload. In Tobruk, they try. And the RAF turns the harbor into a field of moving lights, and then too often still ones. Before midnight, Rommel draws a line with a stick in the roof of a staff car hood and leaves it there so men will see it when they need reminding. Wenn die Versorgung so bleibt, he says, kämpfen wir morgen und verlieren übermorgen. If supply remains thus, we fight tomorrow and lose the day after tomorrow. No one argues. The argument has been settled by the sound the British guns make when they resume their count every dawn. November 2nd, 1942. El Alamein line, 01, 10 hours. The cold finds men through greatcoats, as if the desert had grown 1,000 thin fingers. A tarp flaps on a Bedford as RASC drivers bleed petrol from Bowsers into jerrycans. Ordnance crews stamp their feet beside stacks of 25-pounder cartridges painted the dull promise of brass. Chaplains move down a silent row of Shermans and Grants, handing up enamel mugs that steam like small prayers, in a shallow scrape at Tel El Akakir. Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Keyes unrolls a map across a tank's glacis and taps the point where mine ribbons thin. Here, he says. The door. The men who will kick it are the 9th Armored Brigade Wiltshire Yeomanry, Warwickshire Yeomanry, and the Royal Wiltshire Yeomanry's friends Old Cavalry turned Iron Rams. Their Cromwells still a rumor. Their Crusaders and Shermans already patched with the week's lessons. 1:30. Rommel stands over a signaler's shoulder in a BP-44 caravan and reads a thin harvest of intercepts. RAF shadowing west of Fuka. British armor massing north of Miteria. Ammunition dumps pushed forward under the umbrella of guns that never seem to empty. He reaches for his pen and writes the line he has already said aloud, so it cannot be denied by memory. Later, Gegner verfügt über Artillerie und Munition in Fabrikmassen. The enemy disposes of artillery and ammunition in factory masses. He turns to von Thoma. Where do we have fuel? Thoma's finger moves once across a grease-dark situation board and stops. Enough to hit back at dawn. Not enough to hit twice. 02:05. Out beyond the tape. Sappers of the 2/7th Queens and New Zealanders kneel at the edge of a mine lane and feel the ground like piano tuners. Bangalore torpedoes crawl under the wire with the smug indifference of things designed to do one job. When they burst, they cut black calligraphy against the stars. Farther back, surveyors pick new bearings by the chilly logic of Orion's belt. The gun program for Supercharge is chalked on boards with the unsentimental grace of a train timetable: 500 guns, 3 minutes rhythm, lift 100 yards, repeat. Until the night becomes a comb of iron teeth moving east. 03:00. The British line breathes in and then out. Gull-winged kitty hawks lift nose-lit into a darkness that tastes of cordite. 9th Armored Brigade forms column of squadrons in a shallow depression where dust lies like talc on boots and eyebrows. Tank commanders check turret baskets for spare periscopes, tear cotton to wrap around microphones, and, because some refuse to pretend they are not thinking about it, fold letters into breast pockets. A signaler in the Wiltshires murmurs a line his father taught him, once more into the breach, and then looks startled that his mouth did it unaided. 3:30 H-hour. The 8th Army's guns come alive in one long mechanical animal. The desert turns white, then black, then white again as muzzle flashes walk a ladder. Vickers' guns join in, a peppering undertone. Bofors tilt down and spit at ground targets like angry teachers. Every mortar that can reach throws up a fence. The noise has mass. It presses the lungs. It makes speech a mime show of eyes and hands. Rommel listens from a forward pit and cannot help the old professional reflex admiration. This is what happens when staff colleges, factories, And docks sing the same song. 0405. 9th Armored Advance. The line of tanks climbs the lip of its scrape and moves at 12 miles an hour into a world that has been folded and hammered all week. Immediately, the air is full of white fingers, S-mines launching, smoke pots snoring, tracer bundling the night into bright string. Ahead, the devil's gardens of mines bite steel with equal appetite, Tellerminen flipping road wheels, blast mines caving track runs, limpets that men missed in the dark reaching up to remind them. Crusaders stagger and shrug forward with missing shoes. A Sherman slews, spins one track to dig itself level, and carries on with the calm of a bus driver late for his stop. 420. The 88s find their voices. First a scatter, then a choir long, dry shots punching through the barrage's curtain with the bored malice only well-served guns manage at dawn. In the searching white of star shell, yellow sparks prick the armor of advancing squadrons. Turrets ring like struck bells. The Wiltshires take it frontally and keep coming. Because that is the doctrine tonight: take the pain, make the gap, on the right. The Warwickshire Yeomanry echelon left into a patch of stiffer wire. Commander after commander stands half-exposed to talk a driver around a farm of iron that does not want to be navigated. Sherman B. Fox folds onto its nose and burns clean. Its crew spill out in 3 beads and a 4th that does not move. Nobody stops. There is only a door to kick. 05 Zilger. Ariete stirs on the far side with admirable punctuality. Italian semoventes scuttle into shallow defilade. Guns already laid on the lanes they guessed 2 nights ago. M13-40s heave up beside them like oxen yoked to duty and bad luck. When they fire, the hits are honest 800 yards. Then 600, then 400 as range collapses and courage expands to fill the gap. 10. Panzer's martyrs chip from a flank. Needle guns deathly at side plates. The breach attempt turns into the kind of fight staff maps cannot represent dust. Shouting into headphones that crackle with other men's lives. Loaders who stop being individual and become a muscle that feeds a breach with shells as fast as a hand can move. 0540. The line shivers and then finally splits. A company of the Wiltshires ghosts through a seam where mines thin. Every tank with small wounds, but most still with a voice. Behind. Gaps have bodies in them, twisted crusaders. Grants with their high shoulders broken. Cromwells that came late and died early. Losses scraped the soul by some counts, half the brigade's runners burning or stopped within the first hour. But the door is opened by the width of 4 tanks abreast. And that is all the mathematics requires. Keyes' voice is flat in the net. 9th Armored has done its job. A sentence that is both eulogy and order. 0610, 1st Armored Division rolls. The Sherwood Rangers and the Queen's Bays push their squadrons through wreck and mirage into the gap that cost so much. RAF fighter bombers arrive on the cadence they've been practicing for a week: bomb run, break, strafe cutting a hissing swathe along gun lines that have already limbered twice. German 10.5 centimeter batteries try to hold their nerve in their line. Some succeed, enough to make armor crews duck instinctively every time a shell walks too close to the engine deck. But the tide is the thing now, not the rocks. 7:30, midday. Von Thoma rides forward in a soft-skinned car because everything tracked is married to a job and because he still believes seeing aids thinking. He watches 1st Armored spread into the backfield like spilt Mercury squadrons fanning right for the Rahman track. Left toward Sidi Abd el-Rahman, and knows the clean truth veterans dread: we can still fight, but we can no longer decide. He radios Rommel Panzerkräfte zersplittert. Gegenangriffe erfolglos oder brennen im Artilleriefeuer ab. Armor scattered. Counterattacks fail or burn in artillery fire. Minutes later, he adds the line that hurts more munition off the minimum. Benzin kritisch, ammunition at minimum, fuel critical. Afternoon, November 3rd. The counterblows are brave and doomed. 15. Panzer claws at the seam south of Tel El Akakir, and is slapped flat by a lattice of 25-pounder concentrations keyed to FOU murmurs in slit trenches. Ariete bows out as a formation not through cowardice but through arithmetic. A last clear signal comes up on the British intercept board, sent in a voice that tries for parade ground and lands on Elegy Ariete. Non esiste più. Ariete no longer exists. Rommel's jaw tightens. He orders a step back on the Raman. The answer from above is the stubborn madness that ruins armies halten bis zum letzten. Hold to the last. Night. 3rd into 4th. The 8th Army presses with the same character that opened the week's schedule. Wait, repair. Tank fitters work by feel under tarps freckled with phosphorescent grit. A crewman asleep on a track link becomes a silhouette under a dawn that insists on being honest. Rommel drafts his message to Kesselring with the urgency of a man writing against a tide withdrawal now to Fuka. Then to Mursa, salvage what can roll, save artillery above all. He does not decorate it. He includes tonnage. He includes emptiness. November 4th morning, the hinge goes. British armor pours north and south of the Raman. The coastal railway line that once felt like a guarantor becomes a pointer showing the route of defeat. Columns of Italian infantry move with a dignity that softens the eyes of the men who pass them. Many throw down rifles with the air of men putting away tools after a long, ill-paid job. 90. Like to fight's a beautiful, crisp delaying action with stop lines that make map men nod, then has to walk, because fuel gauges make cowards of the brave and truth-tellers of optimists. Midday brings the last neat thing von Thoma, with the scoured calm of a professional, drives into a British screen and is taken. Dust on his boots and an apology in his eyes for an army he has served well and cannot rescue. A British corporal offers him water. He accepts as if accepting a verdict. In Cairo, a staff captain pins a new phase line. In Gibraltar and Algiers, ships already loading men and Shermans for Torch bend their routes by the hour. The vice is closing. East has broken. West will land. Rommel. Late on the 4th, finds a slice of shade beside a knocked-out Grant and dictates what every general hates to admit. We must break contact, or we break entirely. The message that rides back from the wolf's lair is a command to stand and die on a line the British guns have turned into a chalk smudge. He pockets the paper, turns to his ear, and gives the order that will save what can be saved back to Fuka. Then to Mursa. Carry only what shoots, burn the rest. November 8th, 1942. Pre-dawn off Algiers and Oran. Engines thrummed like a low storm behind canvas as assault flotillas slid in under a lid of cloud. On the bridge of HMS Kerman, a young sub-lieutenant worked a pencil across a grease board. LCP-LS launched. LCVPs loaded. H-hour fixed while in the cramped belly of a landing craft, an American private fidgeted with the strap of an unfamiliar British life jacket and mouthed the words the briefing officer had drilled into them. Algiers, Oran, Casablanca, knock, open. Storm boats nosed forward. Silhouettes of destroyers hung like saw teeth against a faint, bruised edge of light. Far down the African coast, French coastal guns, some manned. Some sleeping waited to discover whether the men in the boats were enemies by orders or allies by instinct. Mid-morning, the radio net in Panzerarmee Africa's caravan world went brittle. A duty officer at the forward signal detachment near Fuka banged open the flap and read the first composite bulletin out loud. The way men announce a death before they admit whose it is, American landings at multiple points in French North Africa. British and American flags on the same ships. Airfields at Maison Blanche and Blida at Hazard. Rommel raised a palm to quiet the room and said nothing for a long 5 seconds, as if listening for a lever somewhere that would shift fate. Then he pointed to the wall map. This his finger traced from the Nile Delta westward to Tunis is now a corridor, not a theater. They are the door we must flee and the door we cannot pass. November 9th. The 8th Army's lead element's armored car regiments that had spent the last week chasing rearguards through drifts of spent shell cases and burst jerrycans touched Fuka and Mersa Matruh like men tapping fence posts in the dark to find the path. Behind them, the train that had made supercharge possible rolled west 25-pounder regiments leapfrogged along the coast road. Indian and New Zealand infantry rode in Bedfords and on captured Italian lorries. Tank transporters carried Shermans whose crews slept across glacis plates with boots still laced. The RAF's Desert Air Force picked up the beat and did not put it down. Baltimore's and Boston's went for road columns. Kitty Hawks scythed low over repair yards. Bowfighters combed the Gulf of Bamba for anything with a wake and an Axis flag. November 10th. Tunisian skies. Kesselring began the only counter that made sense: throw wings ahead of wheels. Ju-52s waddled down a chalked runway at Naples in continuous files, each carrying drums of fuel or a platoon of infantry for Tunis. Mi-109s and Makis curved along their flanks like sheepdogs trying to keep a flock alive. The first German advance parties reached El Awina and Bizerte almost as quickly as the torch columns took the docks at Oran and Algiers. A new front was being hammered together in Tunisia, even as the old one was being peeled up like a rug. November 11th, 13th, 8th Army took Tobruk back without speeches. A cruiser's masthead signal flashed the simplest of truths: harbor secured. And the port that had cost a year of headlines now changed hands in a neat afternoon of reoccupation. Rommel watched the last columns of Ariete's survivors shuffle past a petrol dump whose tank sweated in the heat, and said to his IA, "We cannot fight from Tripoli with ghost fuel." He had sent the message already: logistics, not maneuvers. Ruled the board, but messages had to be written a second time before men who did not smell dust believed them. Mid-November. The coast rode west. Every crossroads wore the look of a problem: half-solved burned lorries at the edges. Mine pickets marking lanes with sun-bleached bones of packing crates. A staff car abandoned with a cigarette still black on the dash. 90. Leichte. The best of the desert infantry. Wrote the kind of textbook rearguards that would be studied by war colleges who preferred arrows to thirst. They laid ambushes with Pak-38s under camo nets and let British columns feel the bite before men in slouch hats flanked them through wadis with the patience of carpenters. The Germans made time with courage. The British made distance with petrol. November 15th, 18th. Intercept boards in Cairo and Malta recorded the new arithmetic. Convoys out of Taranto and Naples had to bull past submarines who had learned the shape of Axis routes by heart. Ju-52s could not carry enough fuel to feed a panzer army fighting and moving. Rommel's evening reports grew curt and unsentimental. Artillery results excellent against massed British concentrations. He wrote one night, because it was true, and because the men deserved to see a sentence that praised their work. The next line skinned the truth to bone. But enemy mass returns by afternoon. Our ammunition expenditure cannot be matched. Fuel at crisis. Withdraw or be encircled. He did not predict miracles. He described weights and measures. November 19th, 20th. Benghazi and the desert beyond. The city fell to an advance guard that had kept its speed by drinking its own shadow. Raya C drivers running 3 nights straight. Fitters changing power packs in sand like surgeons in a barn. From a shattered balcony, a British captain watched Indian mule teams pick their way past an Italian propaganda poster still glued to a wall and thought, with the shame and pride peculiar to professionals, "We have learned this place the hard way, and at last." Rommel took the only decision left to a general who knows the difference between a defeat and a surrender: fall back on El Agheila. Assemble what had not yet burned or been abandoned, and make the smallest front possible feel large by moral force. November 22nd, 25th, Tunisia. The Vice closed from the west. German battalions that had flown into Tunis wheeled north to snatch bridgeheads. French units split some firing, some waiting, some under Darlan's orders, laying down arms with the weary grace of men who choose a future they did not vote for. American columns learned what British ones had paid to teach, that North Africa's roads kink like bad grammar. that Wadi banks are ambushed by nature, that German junior officers are never too clever to be brave. The first skirmishes in the Mejerda felt like an argument beginning. Behind them, the debate's outcome had already been written at sea and at El Alamein, late November. A sandstorm fell across the Libyan littoral like a dropped curtain. Within it, mechanics skinned hands on stubborn bolts. Ration parties stacked crates of bully beef behind a broken culvert. A sergeant of the Royal Engineers tied a scarf over his mouth and led a mine team by feel, as if playing a blind man's game. Rommel dictated to a signals clerk whose pencil rattled in a tin mug when the wind hit the canvas. British superiority in artillery and supply remains decisive. Counterattack from El Agheila cannot be sustained without fuel. Request permission to retire to Buerat. The reply from higher headquarters was the familiar liturgy of men far from dust stand. Counterstrike. Hold. He put the paper down. Wrote a second message to Kesselring that replaced verbs with numbers, and sent both. One would be filed for history. The other might save tanks. December 1st, 5th. 8th Army felt the drag of its own success. Petrol lorries had to cross ground the enemy had left salted with mines. Every advance demanded a day's work from sappers and a night shift from fitters. But the rhythm never stopped. RAF Kittyhawks squatted at captured strips and flew with their wheel covers still spattered in the mud of someone else's home. RAF Baltimore's stitched supply parks at Ajdabiya. Royal Navy subs put 2 more freighters down under skies that smelled of diesel and cordite. In the caravan, a German quartermaster scratched figures on a ration box and realized there was no arithmetic that turned crates into miles. December 6th, 10th. Rommel drove forward to the El Agheila line low dunes, salt flats, scrubbed the last clean choke on the Libyan road. He watched pioneers lay shoe mines between clumps of thorn and thought of the men he had left in hospital tents within earshot of the surf. That night, in a lamp's petroleum stink, he drafted the message that historians would quote when they tried to explain a desert war that had favored speed and punished pride. We cannot match their artillery mass or the flow of supplies that feed it. The 8th Army attacks with fresh units as if from a factory belt. Our counterblows expend the last of our fuel and leave us with brave ruins. I request withdrawal before we are trapped between Tripolitania and Tunisia. In Algiers, an Allied staff colonel drew a heavy pencil line across a map and smiled because he was tired and because the line looked like a solution. In the desert, a British corporal poured petrol from a jerrycan into a Sherman as if decanting a medicine. In Rome and Berlin, men who wore better boots than most soldiers owned wrote orders that insisted the sea could be ignored and that fortitude could replace mathematics. The desert did not read their memos. It read tonnage. It read distance. It read the simple truth that had been marching since the night the guns opened on Supercharge. The 8th Army had broken the hinge, and Torch had hung a second door behind the Axis. The room in between was shrinking. December 11th, 1942. El Agheila Line, Cyrenaica. Wind blew a stale salt off the Sabkat Guzail flats and rattled the camouflage nets like cards in a dealer's hand. Along a low spine of dunes, Panzer III turrets sat up to their mantlets in scooped pits. A Pak-40 crouched under a thorn bush as if it were a hunting cat. Sappers strung shoe mines in scalloped rows that looked almost delicate until you stood close. Lieutenant Karl Drexler, 15, Panzer, ran a gloved finger along the bead of dust that collected at the base of his gun sight, and thought not for the first time that the desert had taught him to count in liters, not in laurels. His loader, a boy with bricklayer's hands, muttered the day's private prayer, a shot when we ask, a gear when we need it, a drum of fuel before we stall. Far East, 8th Army formed for the next push. Montgomery had no appetite for melodrama. He had schedules. Behind a screen of armored cars whose spare tires were painted with white recognition rings, 7th Armored Division methodically topped off jerrycans, greased bogies, checked magnetos. Indian sappers in rolled sleeves leaned over mine prongs, prodding the sand as delicately as violinists. Lines of 25-pounders squatted shoulder to shoulder. Trails dug in. Camouflage netting lifted like veils, while layers sighted and laid. The Desert Air Force rehearsed the overture it had been playing since October. Baltimore's warmed engines on gravel strips cut only yesterday. Kitty Hawks taxied 2 at a time. Gun covers tugged off and stuffed into pockets. A Boston Squadron CO briefed cab rank tactics with a piece of chalk on a Dakota's fuselage. You call. We drop on the code smoke. Red left, yellow right, green center. Don't waste the boys with bad smoke. December 13th. Night. Rommel toured the line with a hooded lamp and a temper he kept coiled. He listened rather than spoke to a coastal battery commander who reported only 13 rounds he and his ready racks. To a quartermaster who could produce receipts for petrol he did not physically possess. To an Italian engineer major who had made a miracle of the marsh. Turning a salty pond into a mirror, an attacker would mistake for ground. When Rommel finally spoke, it was arithmetic with edges. We will hit them first, a riposte, not to throw them back only to make them think. At dawn, 90. Leichte will bite at their left, artillery, short and fierce. Then we go. He did not say where go ended. Everyone could read a map. Everyone had heard the wireless traffic from Tunis. December 14th, first light. A sand-hazed sun pushed up and made every barrel draw a shadow as thin as wire. German guns hit first tight, disciplined, brief. British OPs reported shelling sharp, then silent, and signed off with the fatal sentence, no movement observed. 10 minutes later, the desert answered in plural. 8th Army's guns lifted a sheet of noise that did not pretend at subtlety, 3 field regiments per brigade front at the choke. Mediums stitching the suspected pack nests behind the crest. Smoke where the armor would nose. To the right, where the flats tempted cleverness. A troop of South African armored cars set off across crust that looked sound and wasn't. One car went through with a splash and panicked engine note. 2 others took the caution and cut back into the bad man's corridor, the only lane you could live in. The first British probes found the teeth Rommel had shown them to expect. Pack-40s wrapped, dust jumped in neat, angry cones around a Valentine's tracks. And an AEC armored car died as cleanly as a diagram. A black slit torn under its turret. But the pressure did not abate. Sappers lifted lanes with the grim patience of men playing pickup sticks over death. Infantry went up on trucks, down on feet, up again. A New Zealand FO called in smoke with economy 2 guns. Green left and watched the wall drift exactly where a squadron leader with a white scarf wanted it. 7th Armored, clanking low and deliberate. Put Grants on the hard edge. Shermans in the middle distance. Crusaders to dance on the flanks, and because the lesson had been paid for already, no heroic lunges. Noon. Drexler took his shot at a Sherman that showed too much turret traversing to engage a pack. His AP struck high and did nothing but carve a bright, insulting smear. The answer, a 75mm HE that cracked on the lip of his gun pit, filled his world with powdered sand and the dry taste of cordite. He let the loader curse, then said evenly, "Gert. Next." There were only 5 AP left. He made a decision seasoned soldiers learn to love. He chose not to be brave at the wrong moment. Smoke. Back. His driver went 2 lengths. No more. Just enough to make a new problem for any man who thought he had solved the first. By mid-afternoon, the line had done what lines do when fed bad news and brave orders it had bent. 90. Leichte's counterpunch bloodied a British forward maintenance point burned straw smell. Jerrycans popped like tins on a bonfire and bought 45 minutes. 8th Army spent those minutes with the calm of a bank teller counting notes. A brigade of Indians slipped a company through a fold and made a pack commander abandon a perfect field of fire because his flank had turned into a rumor. A squadron of Shermans found ground that took weight and rolled a seam open where the salt flats met the dunes. The RAF came down like a ruling bullfighters on the coast road. Kitty Hawks hosing the mouths of waddies. Baltimore's thudding he on a patch of thorn scrub that hid a signals truck, whose aerial had been just a little too proud. Evening. Rommel issued the order he had written in his head a week ago. Ausweichen nach Buerat. Echelon back to Buerat. The transport marched first for once doctrine and necessity agreed fuel lorries with their guards, field kitchens with their soot-black chimneys, ambulances whose drivers stared straight ahead as if looking down a city street. Then the guns, hooked and hauled, trails still warm. Then the tanks, in packets, with rear guards set like teeth on each bend of the Via Balbia. Italian bersaglieri on bicycles pedaled in the lee of staff cars. Bugles slung, as disciplined and doomed as men can be without using either word. December 15th, 18th. The retreat becomes a craft. Axis workshops stripped wrecks by heartbeat magnetos, cooling fans, even brake shoes from lorries that would never run again. Then torched the hulks to deny the Commonwealth the same poor meal. German staff cars stopped at column heads not to berate, but to hand out sheets with timings in thick block script no one could mistake in dust. Night halts were set on ground that offered a little cover and a lot of distance from British guns. Camouflage nets were hung with a priest's care for vestments. In the mornings, 8th Army's armored car patrols found footprints where they had hoped for prisoners in mines, where they had hoped for speed. December 19th, Nophelia. A scratch group Kampfgruppe mark snapped shut on a British regiment that had overreached for one hot, wicked hour. 25-pounder batteries fought like anti-tankers, direct laying at silhouettes that moved like wolves in dust. A company of the Rifle Brigade dug in behind their carriers and made a stone wall out of small arms. When the dust settled, 2 panzers burned black in a shallow gully and 3 British carriers sat like kicked-over beehives. Ammo spilled and tins of bully beef punctured by shrapnel. Rommel wrote that night, honest even when tired rear guard at Nophelia executed with skill. But enemy pressure unrelenting, petrol short by half, ammunition shortages now acute in light AA and AT. December 20th, 24th. Buerat became the next last line. A word men speak softly because they have spoken it too often. Engineers blew culverts on the Balbia and recorded the blasts with the satisfaction of craftsmen. Within 2 days, Indian sappers had laid Bailey spans over the tiers and waved Bedfords across with a grin and a hand signal. A British desert column TO, dust-cased and hoarse, admitted to his diary what the propaganda sheets would dress in triumph. It is a race we win by refuel. The RAF kept the clock honest. Ju-52s to Tunis or Tripoli had to fly past bow fighters that hunted in pairs. Convoys from Naples ran a gauntlet of submarines whose captains could now fix track by habit and moon. Christmas Eve, a lull that was not a lull. Men scrounged tree branches to lash to tents and sang songs that belonged in rooms with rugs, in the Axis lines. A Feldwebel cut a cake made of biscuit and jam and told his section to eat quickly. The captain had ordered the march to resume at 2000. In an 8th Army rest area, a chaplain held a service under a tarpaulin that flapped like a loose sail. At the back, a sergeant of the RASC whispered to his mate that the best miracle of the season would be one more tanker into Tobruk. The old hard truth ran underneath the tinsel. The Axis had learned that desert battles finish at a petrol dump. The British had learned to make their guns arrive not once, but each morning, like sunrise, in his caravan. Rommel drafted what would read, when printed in neat type later, like resignation, and in the night like a man saving what can be saved. To hold Tripolitania requires fuel unobtainable. The troops are brave, but bravery is not combustible. Buerat is a stop, not a fortress. Permission to continue withdrawal to the Mareth line is requested. He laid the pencil down and stared at the oil lamp, the flame guttering when the wind worried the canvas. Outside, the desert breathed its cold, indifferent breath. East. Headlamps with blackout hoods winked and went dark and winked again as a British column felt its way. West. The tail lights of the Panzer Armee's last roadworthy lorries crept along like embers carried in careful hands. The desert kept its own score, the arithmetic of miles, tonnage, and a realization that had overtaken the war the week the 8th Army moved at El Alamein and Torch put a wall behind the Axis You can outfight the first blow, even the second, but not the third when it comes wrapped in crates. January 20th, 1943, west of Berat, Tripolitania. A salt wind came off the Gulf of Sirte and set the blackout hoods on retreating lorries to trembling. The Via Balbia was no longer a road. It was a litany headlamp, tail lamp, flare of a cook fire snuffed by a sergeant's hiss, the soft cough of a staff car trying not to be noticed by its own men, in a half-dug slit by the verge. Lieutenant Karl Drexler rubbed grit from the traverse handwheel and watched a column of civilian Fiats pass mattresses roped to roofs. A sewing machine lashed to a boot lid, children looking out through dust as if it were weather. Tripoli, his driver said, not as a destination, but as a word that hurt. Drexler nodded once. The harbor lamps had been dark for 3 nights. Everyone could read a map with their feet. East. The 8th Army came on with the same patient certainty that had unstitched El Alamein. Along the hardstand at Tamet, 25-pounder detachments drank tea while layers rechecked line. When the tea was gone, they hitched and rolled forward another 8 miles as if obeying the sun. Valentine tanks of 23rd Armored Brigade clanked in low gear to spare fuel and tempers. New Shermans rode the center with long-bellied confidence. Armored cars went wide, feeling the crust, leaving pickets like breadcrumbs at wells. Above, the Desert Air Force kept the overture steady, Baltimore's bruising crossroads, Kitty Hawks on the cab rank, Boston's pushing bomb doors open like impatient shopkeepers. January 22nd, Tripoli. Rommel stood with Kesselring on a rise that looked down on a harbor half sunk by accident and enemy will. Cargo lighters lay on their sides like beetles. The mole wore a rash of bomb bursts bleached by spray. A tug nosed a tanker, then thought better of it and wandered like a drunk. A signals officer brought the tally with the composure of a man announcing weather fuel landed yesterday 340 cubic meters. Losses to air attack 180 cubic meters. Ammunition minimal. Rommel's pencil made a small, final sound in his notebook. We cannot hold a city we cannot feed, he said. Not to Kesselring so much as to the sea. Then, louder strip what we can. Destroy the rest. We will go to the French line. Orders moved like a quiet plague. Tripoli's dumps boiled in controlled flame. Mechanics bled trucks of petrol and returned the tins to drivers like communion. Italian rear services, who had learned stoicism in a different century, stacked ledgers in neat piles and set them alight with the same care they had used to write them. A Bersaglieri captain directed traffic with a bugle tucked under his arm. His eyes watered from smoke and from the knowledge that a city was being taken apart with the politeness of thieves who didn't want to wake a house. January 23rd. 8th Army patrols nosed into Tripoli at dawn and found not an ambush but an aftertaste charred fuel drums. Coils of cable, a signboard for Via Roma face down in puddled oil. Monty's advance guard reported the old phrases, harbor unserviceable. Demolitions extensive then added the new one that mattered, enemy retired, on Beni Ulid Tarhuna axis, in good order, in a square that still smelled of espresso and blast. A sergeant of the RASC muttered, "They're not beaten yet." No one contradicted him. Montgomery drove in midday to look at the water and kept the speech short. Backsides on camp stools tonight, boots on again in the morning. We don't chase shadows, we push a timetable. Westward. The Panzer Army became an organism that had learned to live on less. Workshops sorted wounded vehicles like surgeons, this one for cannibal, this one for coercion, this one to be put out of misery with a charge. Luftwaffe Ju-52s ghosted into Melaha at dusk, their tires whispering on gravel. Box after box came off, some full of spark plugs, some of bandages, some of orders, in a lantern-lit van. Rommel dictated what he had been writing in his head since December. To OKW and to Feld Marshal Kesselring. Marath line the only defensible position remaining. Without decisive increase of fuel and ammunition. Counteroffensive impossible. Recommend shortening front and concentrating in southern Tunisia. Tactical successes still possible. Strategic victory no longer within means. The adjutant read it back. The general rubbed his eyes and said, "Send it." January 27th, Mareth Wadi Zigzao. The old French line appeared first as stone blockhouses with slots like scowls, then as earth rubble-faced bunkers sown along the banks of the Zigzao, then as geometry anti-tank ditches crossing wadis like arguments dragged into the open. Major Hasso von Manteuffel walked a sector with an engineer captain who had inherited a century's worth of Tunisian rain calculations from the Army of Africa. "Here the wadi floods," the captain said, tapping his map. "Here it pretends. Here it refuses." Italian artillerymen, sleeves rolled to sunburn, levered 75s onto concrete rafts and sighted by habit on landmarks whose names they pronounced as if they were old aunts. The 10 and 21 Panzer, lean as whippets, slid into orchards and behind palm stands. It looked, for one day, like a line. Behind it, in the hills toward Gabes, another army arrived by rail and bad maps, von Arnim's 5. Panzer Army, new uniforms, hard vowels, crisp orders. Tunisia was no longer a cul-de-sac. It was a hinge with two generals' hands on it. Signals chattered in codes that did not always agree. Kesselring smoothed with charm what he could not smooth with petrol. "Herr Generalfeldmarschall," Rommel said in a caravan that smelled of damp canvas and cigarettes. "We must strike where the enemy is green west, or we must be bled dry here." Kesselring smiled as if at a party and answered, "Both, if we are clever." The map between them did not smile. February 1st. The 8th Army found the Mareth line the way a blind man finds a wall by tapping, then pressing, then stepping back. Indian patrols went into the wadi bottoms and came out with mud to their knees and neat opinions about arcs of fire. New Zealanders eyed the Matmata Hills with the hungry patience of mountaineers told to wait for guides. Corps artillery laid registration by the inch, a hurricane of ranging shots that sounded like a typewriter with a temper. Overhead, the weather sulked between drizzle and glare. The RAF learned quickly that the wadis bit wings. The Luftwaffe learned more slowly that its fighter fields now lived under the eyes of bullfighters with time on their hands. For Drexler's crew, Mareth meant something close to memory-solid cover. Not a foxhole dug with a mess tin, water that didn't taste entirely of iron, mail that found them half the time. It also meant economics with a pistol at the back of the neck. Ammunition chits came stamped and precious. Fuel arrived with an escort. When the loader asked, "If the English come in the wadi, do we wait?" the lieutenant answered as a man who had spent his courage carefully since Alamein. "We wait for the artillery to finish the first sentence. Then we speak once, clearly. Then we move." On the evening sit-rep, the phrases told a story that even the optimistic could read. Tripoli lost as anticipated. Panzer Army established Mareth position. Supply situation critical. Nightly convoys reduced by air and sea action. Torch forces active in west. American 2 Corps in contact at passes. Recommendation offensive action against inexperienced formations before 8th Army can combine with them. A staff colonel underlined before 3 times. The ink spread on the paper. Night, a lull that was not. Engineers hammered pickets. Sappers probed with bayonets where mines should have been and were. Dispatch riders became silhouettes swallowing cigarettes whole, in a tent lit like a parish hall. Rommel briefed a thrust across the hills toward the passes that smelled of America. "We will knock them, and we will buy time for this line," he told regimental commanders who had learned to count time as tightly as rounds. "It is not victory. It is necessity." His voice did not change when he added, quietly, "The war here was decided at Alamein and at sea. We are left to choose the manner of its ending." Outside, the desert exhaled. A lorry coughed. Somewhere along the Wadi Zigzao, a jackal called and was not answered. There's first light. The 8th Army would test the old French concrete again while, to the west, German columns stole toward Kasserines' broken teeth. The choice had been made: bleed one front to bruise the other, and every man along the Mareth line felt the arithmetic settle on his shoulders like sand. February 14th, 1943, Sidi Bou Zid, central Tunisia. Wind pushed cold dust across the lava flats and rattled scrub thorns against half-buried jerry cans. Lieutenant Karl Drexler felt the traverse wheel's chill sting his fingertips and watched horizon heat shimmer around Spear Point palms. To the west, new tracks crossed old Roman roadbeds wide, soft, incautious American armor in penny packets among the domed hills called Jebels. At 0830, the desert stood up. Panzers of the 10 and 21. Panzer divisions crested Jebel Lasuda and Jebel Ksaira like wolves topping a dry wall. Long 75s already depressed. Stukas shouldered in behind them, sirens fighting the wind. On the far side of the basin, Lieutenant Joe Bennett of the U.S. 1st Armored Division crouched in his M3 Lee's sponson, one hand on the 75's breech, the other wiping dust from a sight he did not trust. "They're not supposed to be here," his driver said, which was true of many things that morning. German shells began their clean work one tank, then another. Tidy holes where turrets met superstition. Up on the ridges, isolated American infantry, the 168th and 34th Division men, fought in little islands around radio masts and prayer book rocks while German half-tracks felt for the seams between them. By midday, smoke lay in belts and the basin sounded like a boiler room with bad intentions. Rommel's plan moved with an old hunter's economy: knock the outposts at Sidi Bou Zid, pivot on Spatla, then push the passes Faid, Kasserine, Thala before anyone could agree on who owned which map, south of Jebel Hamra. Italian Centauro tanks rolled in dusty elegance, crews bareheaded and grim. The Hermann Goering Division lent its flak and bravado. Luftwaffe controllers, hunched in radio vans with cigarette ash stalactites, walked Stukas onto motor pools and crossroads. American command nets wobbled, then held, then wobbled again. Orders traveled in past tense. February 17th. Spatla. 8th Army was still tapping at Mareth when the central doors swung open. German columns slid through Spatla's olive groves with the silence of men who had practiced this walk since Tobruk. Bennett's Lee backed and slewed among blooming oleanders, Cokes chattering at silhouettes. An 88 snapped from the shade of a stone terrace and took the Lee under the turret ring. The world banged sideways. Ears rang with the particular bell that means out. Bale Bennett heard himself say from somewhere a foot behind his teeth. He hit gravel, rolled, smelled gasoline change its mind about being liquid. Behind him, engineers torched supply stacks with careful rage. Ahead, military police waved traffic toward Kasserine and Tebessa with batons that looked like magic wands and felt like lies. February 19th, mouth of Kasserine Pass. Rain polished the limestone pink and treacherous. The pass narrowed to a stone throat, steep flanks gouged by wadis. Road and stream feuding for the same groove. Drexler's Panzer IV nosed up among cypresses streaked with mud. Italian bersaglieri in cap plumes jogged along the verges. Rifles at the trail, jackets dark with weather. A forward observer in a battered Kubelwagen wiped his slate with a sleeve and called corrections for an 88 whose crew had bivouacked under a fig. "Feuer," the gun captain said, as if it were a prayer that sometimes worked. Inside the pass, the U.S. 19th Engineers and Infantry Regiments 26th and 16th, patches soaked flat to sleeves stacked mines, rolled boulders, and emplaced their own catechism 105's hub to hub. 155 long toms on the shoulders. Command cars jammed with line reels and anger. British 26th Armored Brigade slid into Thala on the northern axis, Valentines and Crusaders rattling like tea trolleys. Brigadier Dunphy's men tight-lipped and busy. On a cold, wet afternoon, the Allied line relearned a British lesson written at El Alamein, when the infantry is unsure and tanks are out of breath. The guns hold the day. February 20th to 21st, Rommel shoved. Panzer Grenadiers tried the shoulders of the pass, boots slipping on clay, SMGs coughing in gray gusts. Half-tracks nosed hairpins and took a storm of HE on their hoods. Drexler's driver counted gears on his knuckles. The lieutenant picked shots like a man choosing nails. An American anti-tank platoon, new M10s with crews still learning each other's first names, bit the nose off a thrust, then fell back 100 yards and did it again, on the Thala Road. British gunners dragged 25-pounders forward by hand and laid a regimental stonk that hit like a door slamming in a long corridor. An American artillery colonel, jaw set, rain beading on a leather coat, walked his battalions by the map square, tubes firing in time like a rough church organ. "Keep the beat," he told a battery commander whose glasses were mud. They did, for one long, bad hour. Tanks with black crosses burst through a curtain of smoke near the Col de Crea and found nothing but more guns, the mass that Rommel had complained about since Alamein Halfa. Shells came in sheets. Radios barked direction and temperature and love. On a ridgetop, a platoon of American infantry boots, raw. Faces raw are held long enough for a British Valentine troop to clank into a flanking notch and make everyone breathe again. Rommel's forward report that evening was half-truth. Half-wheel pass penetrated, but resistance stiffening. Artillery concentration heavy, fuel low, Italian formations tired. He penciled a line under fuel and wrote it darker. February 22nd. The check. Kesselring wanted the dash to Tebessa and Lekef. Von Arnim argued for consolidating a tidy German bridgehead in northern Tunisia. The sky argued for neither. A grounded Luftwaffe and RAF prowlers making every daylight convoy play dice. At dusk, Rommel stood in wet scrub with a staff map draped over a mudguard and weighed clock's petrol hours. Artillery hours. The last hour you could ask Centauro to sprint uphill and mean it. "We do not have the legs," he said at last. The order to break contact went out in pieces, guns first. Panzers by troop, foot elements in the rain's cover. Drexler rode backward through the pass, eyes on the wet groove his tracks had made, scent of burned brake linings and fennel in his nose. Behind him, Allied patrols edged forward, rifles level, waiting for the mine tape to tell them that a new day had been bought in other men's blood. Night, 22nd to 23rd. In a stinking aid post lit by a bicycle dynamo, Joe Bennett let a Canadian orderly stitch a split scalp and listen to rumors travel Rommel beaten at Thala. Rommel turning back for Mareth, General Alexander coming south, Monty at the French line already. The orderly tightened the last knot and said, "You're lucky." Bennett thought about luck as a tank-sized thing that sometimes chose a different seat. He signed for a new helmet and asked where to find First Armored. "Where the road ends," the orderly said, which was good staff work for that night. February 24th, 27th. Back to the hinges. The Panzer Armee slid east like a rumor returning to its author. Fuel Bowsers wore branches in their radiator grills. Ambulances ran without lamps. Antenna tips hummed a damp music. West. American gun crews stacked shell crates into furniture and discovered they had learned their trade in 2 weeks. British tank fitters in Thala clouted bent road wheels straight and called the place Thalia because it made better poetry of a hard town. Kasserine's legend began to harden, and with it, the Allied habit that would finally break the Desert War: concentrate artillery, concentrate tanks, coordinate infantry. Don't dangle outposts like bait because Rommel's fox still had teeth. In the Mareth sector. Monty read the same ledger and wrote a different column. He walked the Wadi Zigzao parapets with New Zealand's Bernard Freyberg and pointed a stick where the line looked oldest. "We'll not batter the whole wall down," he said. "We'll find the gate to Baga Gap and send the Kiwis and armor round the back. We'll thump here," the stick tapped Mareth, "so Jerry fixes on it. Then we open the door yonder." LRDG patrols went off to count tire tracks where wadis thinned. Free French at Khazari Lane watered mules and sharpened their grammar on German reconnaissance patrols. The Desert Air Force rehearsed cab rank call signs like an orchestra tuning before a hard piece. Rommel reached Mareth on the 25th and found the old French concrete damp and insufficient, the wadis running high, the artillery workmanlike and thin. He called his regimental commanders into a tent that smelled of paraffin and said what he could not say in Berlin. "We will strike first Medellin. If we hit before Montgomery organizes his axes, We may bloody his nose and gain a week. Then we will stand here and here." His finger tapped blockhouse symbols until the canvas trembled. "Understand me maneuver is nearly over in Africa. From now on, we buy hours." Drexler's loader set the last armor-piercing rounds in the turret rack like bread in a cupboard and patted the breech. On the brilliant, indifferent sky, kites hung over the wadi mouths. Somewhere south, New Zealand carriers idled with canvas flapping, waiting for a green light to go somewhere no one had asked them to be before. The desert tightened its belt, across two fronts. The Axis had spent movement to purchase time, and the bill was due at a place whose name meant little to anyone today, Medellin. March 6, 1943, Medellin, southern Tunisia. Before dawn, the wadi beds breathed cold, and the palms along the Gabis road were black combs against a sky not yet decided on light. Bombardier Tom Hargreaves of 142nd Royal Devon Yeomanry Field Regiment cupped a match in both hands and watched it fail twice before the third flame took. Around him, the gun line lay in patient geometry, 25-pounders hub to hub. Ammunition limbers nosed into shallow scrapes, phone lines stitched to a latticework of stakes, a mile forward. The anti-tank screen 6-pounders dug in low. A sprinkling of long-barreled 17-pounders with their muzzles wrapped in sacking pointed like a row of cold fingers at the Medellin plain. The night had carried a rumor officers pretended not to know the Germans were coming with everything that still answered to a starter handle. Just after 07 Huzur, the plane announced them without drama dust where no wind should be, faint tracks wide apart. The slow lift and settle of silhouettes you could feel in the ribs before you could count road wheels. Oberleutnant Karl Drexler sat high in his Panzer IV's cupola and saw the British line the way a carpenter sees a wall plumb, braced, ungenerous. He had fretted over petrol figures all through the night halt. Now there was only the drill. "Vorwärts," he said, and the driver eased the box through second, off to his left. Stub-nosed Semovente assault guns from Ariete looked like angry milk churns in the half-light, somewhere behind. Rommel's voice on the net was clipped and careful, the sound of a surgeon walking toward a risk he had not chosen. Montgomery had chosen his risk and removed most of it. Ultra reports and air reconnaissance had told him the axes. Engineers laced the approaches with mines. New Zealand infantry and Indians dug the gun pits as if they meant to live in them. The Desert Air Force hung above the field in cab rank stacks. Kitty Hawks and Hurricanes turning lazy, disciplined circles while controller jeeps thumbed microphones. At H hour, the British guns opened like an iron theater. Hargreaves's layer called the bearing and the elevation 012. Add 25, and the 25-pounder spoke its dry. Authoritative sentence along the line. Shells crossed with the fussy precision of trains through a junction, each battery firing to time on a schedule written on acetate the night before. Drexler's platoon hit the first belt and found the second behind it. A 6-pounder lashed from a thorny rise and snapped the leading Mark IV at the sprocket. Another gun bit high into a mantlet and reduced a turret to bad dreams. He traversed to take the flash and saw, with professional dismay, that the gun's barrel was already depressed for his counter-slew. The round plucked his track guard like a guitar string and took the radio frame off the hull with a noise that made the loader flinch. "Smoke," he shouted, and 3 pots boiled the air white. Through it came a bird growl and a diving glint, Kitty Hawks dropping 40mm cannon fire like a beaded curtain over a company of Centauro tanks. South of him, a push by 10. Panzer simply stopped, hulls making shallow V-shapes in the sand as crews peered out of cupolas at a problem that refused all their verbs. By mid-morning, the attack had become a checklist of failure. German and Italian tanks struck in packets. Never a true wave. The British guns smashed each in turn. The anti-tank screen hard as an abacus and just as patient. A 17-pounder on a low knoll knocked the nose off a long-barreled Mark IV at 800 yards. The round's arrival startling in its flat. Immediate authority. On the air net. Controller call signs shrapnel red. This is Bonzo walked fighter bombers onto new targets. Each run a neat paragraph at the foot of Montgomery's syllabus. Hargreaves watched an Italian assault gun try to bully its way through a beaten strip and get lifted an inch by a mine. The crew bailed and ran into a sheet of HE that made the ground angry. He marked another round in his book, as if he were not writing deaths but keeping faith with arithmetic. At noon, Rommel's radio log grew short and honest panzer losses heavy. Advance halted by concentrated artillery and anti-tank fire. Luftwaffe support limited. Ammunition expenditure high, fuel low. He asked 15. Panzer for one more push, and got back 2 truths the line had not moved. The stock of courage had, but not in his favor. Just after 2 in the afternoon, he ordered the attack shut down in sections, like a waterworks closing valves. Drexler backed his tank through pale smoke. The loader's hands slick with oil and nerves, and counted the holes in the day's plan by the number of burning silhouettes that made their own weather. March 7th and 9th, the admission in plain speech. Medellin cost Rommel more than he could spare dozens of tanks he could not replace, crews he could not school again, and more quietly. The last minutes of maneuver left to him before Mareth, in a quiet tent that smelled of paraffin and wet canvas. He wrote the report Kesselring would recognize as a capitulation of a kind. The British artillery is massed beyond our means to suppress. Their supply is secure. Our air arm cannot protect daylight movement. Our fuel cannot support counter-maneuver. On March 9th, ill and exhausted, Rommel left Africa, bound for Germany and a convalescence that wore the outline of exile. Command would devolve to von Arnim, with Mess's 1A Armata holding the French concrete at Mareth and the Germans shouldering the line's northern hinge. If Alamein had broken the idea of Axis momentum, Medellin broke the habit of pretending it might return. March 16th to 22nd, Mareth, the old wall and the new door. Operation Pugilist opened with rain tapping the parapets and the Wadi Zigzao running like a hand across the map. British infantry went straight at the old French forts and found them honest, thick walls. Interlocking fields of fire, concrete that answered he with shrugs. Tanks tried the Wadi crossings and slithered backwards, mud on their teeth. Monty let the frontal chore continue because it kept German eyes on the wrong gate. Far to the southwest, Free French at Khazar-Rilain held the flank with wiry contempt for being outnumbered. And New Zealand's Bernard Freyberg assembled a hard, fast column at Medellin's back door, 6th Armored Division tucked in behind Kiwi infantry. LRDG and armored cars out feeling the sand for certain ways that maps called impossible. March 26th, 27th. Tobaga Gap Supercharged 2. A gate, not a siege. Monty had said with that schoolmaster's certainty the 8th Army had come to trust. The gap was exactly that hills shouldering apart just enough for a division and its temper. At first light, the Desert Air Force stacked its squadrons in a shining maypole above the gap. Freyberg's men went in low and fast, Maoris humming through scrub, Vickers guns at hip height, 6-pounders bouncing behind universal carriers like faithful dogs on the controller net. The old El Alamein phrase returned with new desert dust on it. Cab-ranked targets by the bend, armored line under the palm, guns at the knuckle. Kitty Hawks and Spitfires scissored down until palm fronds shivered. Bombs walked the spurs, cannons stitched the gun pits. A German staff wagon backed into a rock and rode off its rear axle. Its commander rode off the position. By midday on the 26th, 6th Armored was through the hinge and pointing for El Hama with its antennae humming like harp strings. On the 27th, they found the El Hama road and beat it into a different shape with tracks and willpower. The Mareth line, anchored on the Wadi and the old concrete, no longer anchored anything. It hung from a nail and the wall had moved. Von Arnim and Messe ordered the break that every defending general hates, and good ones survive night withdrawal to the Wadi Akarit. Retie the threads, pretend the rug has not already been pulled. Along the coast road, engineers cut demolition charges, then removed them again when panic changed to plan. Along the tracks, African riflemen from 1A Armata stepped in time to a drum no band would own, rifles at the trail, eyes already sore from sand they had marched through twice. At a field dressing station near Medellin, Hargreaves watched the Kiwi stretchers coming back mud-streaked, quiet, alive, and realized the army he served had learned to turn corners on purpose. He rode home that night on a page gone soft from sweat and dust. The Boche tried it on here and broke his teeth. We went round his marath and knocked. The door opened. Across the line. In a candle-lit room where the map pins had been pulled so often, the cork looked like a moth-eaten coat. Drexler's regimental adjutant summarized the month with professional poverty losses considerable. Ground relinquished by order. Supply inferior. Enemy artillery and air superior. The season of movement concluded. He did not write the sentence Drexler felt in his shoulder. After Alamein, we fought for time. At Medellin, we began to live on it. April 6th, 1943. Wadi Akarit, central Tunisia. Dawn came in strips pale over the salt flats. Rust along the Razorback Hills. Corporal Tom Hargreaves tasted cordite already. A trick of nerves and last night's gun cleaning. The 8th Army lay cupped behind the dry riverbed, as if the desert had set out pews for an unpleasant sermon. On the right, 50th Northumbrian Division's bayonets pointed at the jumbled heights called Jebel Fatnessa. To the left, 51st Highland bristled along a lip of broken rock. Indian battalions threaded the gullies between. The guns began not with a clap, but a long iron inhalation. 25-pounders and mediums dragging their brackets across the sky from map references plotted the night before. Hargreaves called fire until the word lost its corners, far out. Panzers stirred and were still, then tried to move and were still again. The barrage walked, the infantry followed. And the line that had seemed French concrete hard revealed itself for what it was this late in the war, a door with hinges if you knew where to look. Oberleutnant Karl Drexler learned the hinge the hard way. His Panzer IV nosed into a shallow cut to cover a platoon of machine gunners resighting their weapons. And a 6-pounder hidden behind a ruin picked the moment he had forgotten existed between traverse and depression. The round struck low and tore off his return roller. The next caught the mantlet and broke the day into pebble bites of steel that rang inside the turret like hail. He remembered to say Rauch, and the loader remembered to grab 2 pots and chuck them out the turret. But the smoke only made the feeling worse lost in a room you thought you knew. He edged back, tracks mewing, and saw to the south a shape with shoulders and purpose, Churchills filling the wadi crossings like oxen leaning into a plow. They were ugly and unstoppable, and behind them the infantry came on in short, hammered steps that had learned how far to trust courage and how far to trust artillery. By noon, Akarit's edge had folded. The Axis line peeled back north like old tape. The radio net carried a new, thin frankness, ammunition short. Infantry tired. Counter moves blocked by air. The Desert Air Force had built a sky ladder that morning Spitfires. Kitty Hawks. Baltimore's swapping altitudes like dancers trading partners. When the ground controllers on the forward jeeps said bend in the wadi, guns in the elbow. The controllers upstairs turned the words into falling metal with professional neatness. Montgomery did not press where the sand would take his feet out. He turned the corner he had set for himself at Tabaga and walked into the space the old French line had been pretending to hold. April 19th, 1943, Enfideville. The enemy chose the next ledge hills tight as knuckles above groves that still smelled of citrus if you were foolish enough to raise your head to find out. Here Mess's 1A Armata made a grudging line, and here the 8th Army learned that hills are not wadis. Attacks went in and came back with fewer names. The ground took each shell and gave back splinters. "We'll pin here," the brigadier said, "and let 1st Army do the walking." So the Highlanders settled into rocky scrapes, and Hargreaves's battery traded accurate insults with German guns near Bouficha day after measured day, while to the northwest the battle changed color. April 22nd, 25th, Long Stop Hill. The rain came in hard nails. British 1st Army had been tugging at the cork on Tunis's western bottle since winter. Now it came loose all at once in mud and bayonets. Guardsmen and Hampshires, U.S. infantry from 2 Corps clawing toward Jebel El Amera long stop, to men with cold hands and short breath. They went up in files that broke and reformed. Under MG-34s, that sounded like torn linen, over rock that offered no cover but the angle you could make with your own spine. A captured German major remarked later, with the politeness of a beaten professional, that the mountain had been taken correctly. Correctly meant 2 nights and a day. Companies arriving in tatters and leaving as rumors. Guns dragged by mules that refused and then consented. When Longstop fell, the map in von Arnim's headquarters developed a hole you could put 2 fingers through and feel the sea breath from Tunis. Late April, Operation Vulcan. First Army pressed from Medjez el Bab. The French pushed along the high shoulders. Americans came in like a fist from the northwest. Every morning, the staff officers wrote a new plan in grease pencil. Every evening, the infantry revised it in mud. Kesselring's messages from the south grew prescriptive, then anxious, then blurred by weather reports that were really apologies. Too few Ju-52s, too little fuel. Too late, Drexler's regiment, refilled with boys whose boots still squeaked, was sent to a ridge whose name he did not catch because names were no longer the point. Hold, the general said. We will hold, the colonel replied. The ridge held until a troop of Shermans climbed a track the colonel's map did not admit existed, and a platoon of British sappers blew a cut in the crest, and the regiment found out what holding meant when the world has gone behind you as well as in front. May 6th to 7th, 1943, Operation Strike. The last big push opened with weather too clear to hide in. The air over Tunis sounded like scaffolding being taken down by men in a hurry. Hargreaves's battery fired at timetable lifts so neat even the drivers could hum them, and the infantry walked in underneath as if into a heavy rain they knew was passing. Germans, who had spent a lifetime believing in counterattack, found that every movement they chose had already been guessed and blocked by something with tracks or wings. On the afternoon of the 7th, Bren carriers rattled through the white streets of Tunis, where balconies threw thin shadows, and people appeared as if they had been painted behind shutters and were now allowed to breathe. A British armored car crew leaned out to read a shop sign, as if to be sure they were really in a place that could be read. Up the coast, Americans rolled into Bizerte. The bottle had lost both ends. May 9th, 13th. The long surrender. The sound changed, first less metal, more boots. Columns came down the roads without order and then with it. Artillery horses led by boys who had never seen a horse. Staff cars with their bonnets up like helpless birds. Tanks abandoned in Palmetto with their hatches open to a sky that had stopped being a threat. Von Arnim, square and tired, gave himself up on the 12th to British officers who treated the moment as neither triumph nor comedy, but as the workday's last item. Messe yielded his army the next day. Units folded in on themselves and became names on lists gefangen to be counted and shipped. The number grew in mouths along the line as if telling it could make it ordinary 250,000 Axis troops in the bag, give or take those still coming out of culverts with their hands high and relief higher. That night, Hargreaves sat on an ammunition box behind a 25-pounder that did not need him, and listened to a silence so large he mistook it for music. He wrote a line to his father he would blot and rewrite. We have reached the end of the desert's road and found a city where the guns echo only once, in a tent that smelt of stale tobacco and linen. A clerk slid Rommel's old reports into a file whose label the unit would change from current to history, before morning notes about British guns massed beyond counter battery, about railway timetables that worked, about fuel that arrived when called for instead of when wished for. Drexler smoked a confiscated cigarette on a slope above a lager of prisoners and realized his shoulders had forgotten how to expect an order. He thought, without rancor, of El Alamein's night sky and the way the barrage had eaten the horizon, and of Medenin's iron wall, and of all the maps between that had pretended to offer choices. The generals had known before today Kesselring with his arithmetic, Arnim with his shortages, Rommel with his blunt, unfancy phrases that the Desert War was not being lost, but had been. Page by page, after El Alamein turned the book, The last chapter had not surprised them. It had only required them to read it aloud. October 23rd, 1942. El Alamein, Egypt, 21:40 hours. Wind moves over the Qattara Depression like a slow hand across glass, whispering through camel thorn and wire. In the forward command post of Panzerarmee Africa, General der Panzertruppe Georg Stumme lifts the handset of a torn FUD-2 field radio and hears only the soft breath of sand. A flare rises white beyond the Tel El Isa ridge, hangs and dies. Then the desert inhales. The first British shells land in a measured sheet, as if an invisible carpenter had laid a straight edge across the horizon and scored it with fire. Gun flashes multiply from the 8th Army's gun lines, 25-pounders, 6-inch howitzers, 4.5-inch mediums, an iron choir of more than 800 tubes answering a single conductor. The sound comes in layers, the raw crack of the nearest batteries, the heavier, rounded thump of the mediums, the dry rattle of shrapnel in the wire, and beneath it all, the steady tremor that makes tea in enamel mugs ring against trench walls, in the thin light of a hooded lamp. A young signals officer named Lieutenant Weber raises his head, bone-white face striped by sweat and dust. Feuer Überfall, he says, finding the obvious word because there is nothing else to grab. Fire raid. Stumme steps outside into the open night because he refuses to think inside a tent. Tracer stitches the dark. Green British, red Axis. Like two angry hands sewing the same wound from opposite sides. He senses, more than sees. What the staff maps have warned for days, Montgomery has massed artillery in depth and aligned it on the enemy like a dialed combination. To the south, where the salt pans and minefields narrow to a thin neck against the impassable Qattara. A distant spark becomes a burning ribbon, engineers blowing lanes under a plan with a polite, ironic name, Lightfoot. Men with light feet. Montgomery has told his brigadiers, "We'll walk through the mines where tanks cannot yet go, and the lanes will be widened behind them for armor." Report from 164. Liked, Weber calls, cupping his hand over the microphone. They are taking heavy concentrations. Request counter-battery. Counter-battery. Stumme glances to the west, where the Africa Corps' long barrels, famous 8.8 cm flak 36s, push down to ground roll stand with their crews. Ammunition is low. Fuel is lower. Every 88 fired tonight is a promise that tomorrow's withdrawal, if it comes to that, will be slower. Far forward, Italian paratroopers of Fulgor crouch in slit trenches they have dug like artisans, neat and deep, undermined tape and tripwire, faces taut under rimmed helmets. To the center, Ariete and Littorio tankers sit on the decks of their M1340s and Semoventi, listening to the British barrage roll like a drumline over their arcs. Primo caro avanti. A sergeant mutters first tank forward, but the order does not come. The ground shakes again and again. Somewhere on the right, a column of British Matildas and Shermans is still only an idea pacing behind the minefield corridors, but the idea feels heavy in the bones. The Africa Corps' field telephone clicks alive with a voice Stumme recognizes at once. General Major Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, the iron-spined commander of the DK, Feindlich Sperrfeuer auf unsere vorderen Linien. He says the enemy is laying blocking fire on our forward lines. A heartbeat later, through static, our recon patrols report dummy tanks moved in the north. Deception. Yes, but the weight is real. Operation Bertram. The British camouflage and feint effort has been on everyone's lips: wooden tanks, bogus supply dumps, staging where nothing would later attack. The trick has done its work. Axis reserves sit where they should not, and the real hammer falls elsewhere. Overhead, the RAF's bombers arrive to the Tick Wellingtons and Bostons in low strings. Then the angular shadows of Kitty Hawks corkscrewing to shepherd them. The nearest Axis searchlight loses the beam when dust thickens. A Bofors gun barks in green beads that vanish into murk. Stumme's driver, Feldwebel Koch, points east, where a broad white arc of light blooms and fades. Blooms again, British star shells stepping their light forward in precise 3-minute paces with the barrage. They walk with their guns. Koch says, half to himself, as if the desert had roads painted on it. The 1st British Infantry waves strike in the north a little after 20 Taros Indo's 9th Australian Division, pushing at Tel El Isa. 51st Highland Division feeling into mine belts with white tapes and Bangalore torpedoes, sappers on their bellies, bayonet scabbards shivering against mine stanchions. Along the Risa line, German machine gunners of 164, Leichte and Italian Savona companies open with MG-34s and Breda 30s. The tracers smearing into refuse against the artillery haze. The counterfire cuts lanes and then loses them. The British have rehearsed this engineer's work in twos. One probes while the other's hand checks the line. And when one falls, another hand finds the tape and continues. A runner from 90, Leichte Div, boots white with alkali dust, stumbles into the CP with a report sheet rolled in his fist. Our forward platoons ask for flare pistols. The British are through in the first belt at point 23. Stumm turns the slip over. The pencil lines are too straight. The minefield design. Carefully set over months, Devil's Gardens looks like a neat garden from above and like a death lottery from inside it. Tell them to hold by posts, he says. By posts, not by continuous line. The lesson from Gazala and Knightsbridge still holds. Lines break. Posts bite. A sudden silence falls, that terrible, hopeful hush. Stumme feels it with his boots. The British guns have paused to catch the barrage up to new coordinates. In that pocket of quiet, a German Nebelwerfer battery, saved for this exact heartbeat, looses a salvo 6 pipes, then 6 more, wailing organ rockets that smear the desert with burning commas. The British pause tightens. Then the artillery answers again. Methodical and larger, and the moment is washed away. A telephone rings. It is 15, Panzer's operations officer. Breath short. A gap opens near Miteria Ridge. We can hold it tonight. Tomorrow, without fuel, he lets the sentence die. The paperwork in Stumme's map case says the same in numbers. Panzerarmee has tanks, but they are thirsty. It has guns, but not enough shells. It has men, but too few trucks to move them twice in one day. Near midnight, Stumme insists on seeing the forward line himself. He climbs into a dusty Horch, Koch at the wheel, Weber in back with the handset and a coil of wire on his knees. They nose along a track that only desert eyes can see, past the wreck stalks of burned Grants and Pisa the 3 from earlier fights, past a water bowser riddled and abandoned, past Italian signalsmen laying line by hand, at a bend screened by scrub, light flowers in front of the bonnet British flare. The next second is a machine, a clatter of MG fire, the thock of a nearby mortar, Koch wrenching the wheel, sand grinding under tires. Stumme ducks, then straightens, meaning to stand on his feet when he dies. He does not die, not yet. But his heart clenches under the twin weights of shock and heat. He sags in his seat. Koch brakes hard in a shallow dip. Weber scrambles out, grabs the general under the elbow, calls for a medic who is not there. The barrage goes on. The desert keeps its secrets. By dawn, a rumor will run through staff tents that Stumme fell under British fire near the front. The official line will call it heart failure under stress. Ritter von Thoma will step to the front of the line to steady the decay. Behind the blast curtain of the barrage, Montgomery's jaws keep opening. Lightfoot's infantry teeth gnaw lanes wide enough for armor. Dummy supply dumps have misled Luftwaffe cameras. Real supply, hauled with the dogged certainty of British lorries and Egyptian drivers. Now makes its own arithmetic. The 8th Army can fire longer than Panzer Army can answer. A dispatch rider skids in a cloud of grit and thrusts a folder into Weber's hand. Rommel still ill in Germany, but sending sharp, tired signals through his chief of staff has telegraphed the line that will shadow every German decision for the next fortnight. Conserve tanks. Strike only when target and fuel align. Refuse the battle of exhaustion. The night walks on, muzzles flashing, mine stakes ticking, engines turning and turning, somewhere to the north. The Australians edge a strong point called Thompson's Post by inches and bayonet work, somewhere to the south. 7th Armored probes at the depression's lip and pulls back, leaving the day's decisions for another dawn. In the Panzerarmee CP, candles gutter in tea tins. Ritter von Thoma studies a sand table with a poker's eyes and tells the air. We will counter at first light. We must. He knows. As you can feel he knows. That first light will not be enough.